Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let's begin with prayer. As always, God, we offer ourselves to you, surrendering to your holy presence, aware that you are always with us wherever we are, praying that this time this morning might be useful to you to accomplish further your purposes in all our lives. May we be open to whatever your Spirit wants to do in us and with us. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So we begin with Psalm 139, one of the most cherished psalms in the whole Psalter, but one also with a significant difficulty that we'll get to. We spent most of our time this morning in the in-person group on Psalm 139 and only a short time on Psalm 140, and it may turn out that way today. We'll see how we do in the video. So the opening section of Psalm 139 details the knowledge that God has of the psalmist. Notice how many times the word know, K-N-O-W, is used, or knowledge, or a synonym for knowing, such as discerning, searching, or are acquainted with. I'm using the NRSV, and there is a word that is the synonym of knowledge in every verse of the opening 6 verses except verse 5, which uses a different metaphor about God's hand. So the psalmist believes and understands that God knows him thoroughly, that God is able to search him, his past, his history, but his thoughts as well. God is acquainted with all the psalmist's ways, all his doings, all his activities. Even before a word is spoken, God is aware of what the psalmist is going to say. Such knowledge is so amazing to the psalmist. He can hardly comprehend it. It is so high, he says, I cannot attain it. Another thing I noticed here in the opening 6 verses is the alternation of the first person pronoun and the second person pronoun, the I and thou. And that speaks in the same way that Martin Buber did in his book, I and Thou, of the intimate relationship that the psalmist believes he has with God because of who God is and what God does. This is not the psalmist in search of God. This is God thoroughly knowing and surrounding the psalmist with his presence and his knowledge. That there is, for the psalmist, this sense that God knows him absolutely, completely, and no part of his life, current or past, is unknown to God. And that for him is amazing. I want to ask myself about verse 5, whether this is a positive thing for the psalmist, or does it have a downside? You hem me in. Now, I don't like being hemmed in. Maybe you do? I doubt it. That way of putting it is somewhat negative. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand on me. I can see how it would be negative. It's probably not in the psalmist's understanding. This is like in the St. Patrick's breastplate song, poem, Christ above me, Christ below me, Christ before me, Christ behind me. The sense that St. Patrick or whoever wrote St. Patrick's breastplate song poem had of the surrounding presence of Christ. And I think that's what the psalmist intends here. But I am very interested in the word hem in. And I think when God lays his hand on the psalmist, that's a good thing. It's a calming thing. It's an assurance thing. At church, when we have coffee hour after the worship service and somebody comes and lays a hand on my shoulder, I'm never afraid. I always know it's a friend. And I always know it's someone who cares enough to touch me to get my attention, and I welcome that. So I think the psalmist doesn't mind that God places God's hand, metaphorically of course, on the psalmist's life. But I do recall that Job did not. In the book of Job, with the sufferings that Job has had in the opening of the book, he gets to the point where he says to God, just leave me alone. Let me swallow my spit and die. Stop bugging me. Stop being present with me. Leave me alone. At least leave me alone. Because he feels he's been persecuted by God for no good reason. Well, I don't think that's the same thing that's going on here, but I am interested in this whole idea that the psalmist may feel, to some degree, hemmed in. And that's reinforced for me by verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Why would the psalmist raise that question at all? Why would he use the verb flee, escape, run away? Does he feel oppressed by the presence of God, by the knowledge that God has of him, that he has no privacy? He has no privacy. God knows everything about him all the time, and that may feel oppressive. It would be for you and me if it were another person who was always there on our heels, never leaving us alone, never stopping talking, always present. Sometimes we might just want to get away. Well, more so if you're an introvert like I am than an extrovert like you may be, right? You like the presence of people, and the more the merrier, and they energize you. And for me, being here in this study, to some degree, not all day, but to some degree and for some time, by myself, is energizing and renewing. That's one of the differences between introverts and extroverts. Is the psalmist an introvert? Is he a little tired of being surrounded by the presence of God? Maybe. Maybe he raises this question of wanting to flee from God's presence because it sometimes feels oppressive to him, and he's not always proud of what he does or what he thinks, since God knows all his thoughts as well as his words. The psalmist doesn't always think or do what is pleasing to God, and he isn't necessarily happy that God always knows all that stuff about him. It could be embarrassing. I'm embarrassed that God knows everything about me. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Well, as you know, the answer is nowhere at all. If it were a matter of how high can I go, you can't go anywhere higher than heaven, and God is there. And you can't go anywhere lower than Sheol, the place of the dead, and God is there in the ancient worldview. God is even in Sheol. That's unusual. Usually in the Old Testament, Sheol is the place where God is not. But here, God is even present in Sheol. I find that hopeful. Now, not only is it a matter of height and depth, but how about horizontal distance or space, east to west, let's say. Well, if I take the wings of the morning and settle in the farthest limits of the sea, that is, the sun rises in the east as far as the horizontal view of the psalmist is to the east, across the desert, toward the east, toward Babylon, toward the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As far as he can see to the east, the sun rising up on the wings of the morning and setting over across the Mediterranean Sea. If the psalmist were on the shore, as he surely has been at some time in his life, he sees the sun setting into the sea and wonders how far away that is from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun. If he takes the wings of the morning, but then settles at the farthest limits of the sea, how far does that sea go? He doesn't know probably that it goes through the Straits of Gibraltar and on into the Atlantic Ocean and to lands unknown to the ancient world. But even there, as far as the east is from the west, your hand shall lead me. There's that hand again. The hand that hemmed him in before and behind and was laid on him. Some commentaries say the hand is the hand of the shaper of the psalmist's life, like the potter shaping the clay. I don't get that sense here, but that's in some of the commentaries. Here the hand appears again in verse 10, the metaphorical hand of the Lord that leads the psalmist and holds him fast. That's a security thing, I think. It could be read negatively, but I don't think it's intended that way here. It's a security thing. I am held fast by God, in God's presence, in God's care, held fast and secure. So we've seen height and we've seen width, horizontal space, and now we get to another way in which we might flee from God. Up or down, no. East or west, no. God is always there, as high or low as we go, as far one way or the other that we can go. God is always there. Is that, I wonder, something, just by way of footnote, that the psalmist discovered during the Babylonian exile? That they thought they were leaving the land of Yahweh and abandoning the destroyed temple, and how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And then they found that they could sing the Lord's song in a strange land and that God was still there with them. Maybe that psalmist learned that wherever you go, there's God. Wherever you go, there is the one who loves you, forgives you, and lays his hand on your life to guide you. Maybe he discovered that in the Babylonian exile. But he speculates in verses 11 and 12 about another way to hide from God, and that's in the dark. And as I said in the study notes, I've tried to hide from God. You can't do it. God is still loving you, forgiving you, present with you, even if you try to hide from God, whether that's in the dark or in some other place that you don't want anyone to see you or know you, and you want to hide from God, even from God. And it's impossible. You can maybe hide from other people. I think I have successfully done that at times. But maybe not. Maybe I'm more optimistic about that than reality would warrant. I have wanted to hide aspects of my life, even from myself. But I can't hide them from God. There is no darkness deep enough to hide from the presence of God, for even the dark is light to you. I think this last two verses, 11 and 12, suggest that even though verses 7 through 12 are theoretical, that is, the psalmist is saying, if I did this, if I did that, what about that? It's speculative and theoretical, yet it's questions he's thought about. He's thought about trying to escape from the presence of God. Where can I flee from your presence? We might say to the psalmist, why would you want to? And he would say to us probably, haven't you ever wanted to hide the things that you have thought and done that are not worthy of the glory of God? And we'd have to say yes. So I think he has thought about the possibility of hiding from the presence of God, but as he's thought about all the possibilities, none of them could ever be true, because God is everywhere that we are. As the hymn writer said, everywhere that we can be, thou God art present there. And I think that's in Joyful, Joyful, we adore thee, if I remember right. And everywhere that we can be, thou God art present there. There's not a branch or flower below, but makes thy glories known. And tempests come and tempests blow by order of thy throne. And all that borrows life from thee is ever in thy care. And everywhere that we can be, thou God art present there. Is that a famous poet? You could look it up. It'll tell you in a hymn book who wrote that. I forget. It's a 19th century, late 19th century, isn't it? Early 20th century sometime. That hymn that goes to Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, Lord of love. That one. One of those verses talks about the omnipresence of God. So if verses 1 through 6 are God's omniscience, certainly verses 7 through 12 are God's omnipresence. And now, the psalmist in verses 13 and following talks about how intimately God has known him from birth to death. That the whole span of his life is lived out in intimate relationship with God. It was God who formed him in his mother's womb from conception on. It was God who formed my inward parts and knit me together in my mother's womb. Wow, I am amazingly, fearfully, wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. I realize that, he says in verse 12. Even my skeleton, my frame, as flesh was being attached to it, even my bones and my flesh were not hidden from you when I was being made in secret. That is, we can't see into the womb, except, of course, by ultrasound today, and not at all in the psalmist's day. We are being made in secret in the womb of our mothers. And then he says, intricately woven. Isn't that an interesting way to think about how the baby grows inside the mother? Intricately woven, he says, as he thinks about it. And he says, in the depths of the earth. Well, that's in parallel to in secret. So I think this is Hebrew poetic parallelism. But in the depths of the earth, being created from the depths or in the depths of the earth reminds me of ashes to ashes and dust to dust. That God created Adam out of the stuff of the ground and created life to him in Genesis, in the story in Genesis. Out of the depths of the earth he was formed, out of already existing substance. And your eyes beheld that unformed substance. So God knew us from conception on. Psalmist every day of his life, even before he was born. And he says a surprising thing here in verse 16. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me. So not only was the psalmist formed, but the days of his life were formed. And we had a brief discussion of that in the class this morning in person, and debated the detailed nature of God's knowledge of us and our days, whether everything we ever have done and will ever do is already known to God and therefore must somehow exist in the mind of God, and therefore we're just living out a script with no real freedom, though we think we have freedom. Everything we will do is already known by God. See, I don't believe that. I believe that there is free will, that we should trust our experience of freedom and moral responsibility, and that we do have meaningful choices. We have trivial choices as well. Who's going to win the Super Bowl? You can choose the Eagles or the Chiefs, and of course by now you know the outcome if you follow sports at all. And I was wrong. I picked the Eagles and they did not win. I had free will to pick either one, but I picked the wrong team. Fortunately, no money was involved. But I don't believe that everything we ever do or say or don't do and don't say are already planned out by God, so that we don't have any real freedom. And I don't think that's true. I think we should trust our sense of freedom. God knows everything that exists, but the future doesn't yet exist. I don't think it even exists in the mind of God in any detail. God knows everything that exists, but the future doesn't exist. It's being made as we live it out. Well, this is a subject in theology called the openness of God that lots of people object to and other people find helpful. I'm one of the people who finds it helpful. I think God, like a supercomputer, remember, like a supercomputer. God is not a supercomputer, not an object. God is being itself, as well as intimately involved with each of us in our lives. But because God has all the data and knows that data completely and thoroughly, just as the opening of this psalm suggested, because God has all that data, God's ability to predict things is approaching 100%. So will I pick Special K for breakfast or Wheaties? Well, God could probably predict that since I tend to take the cereals on the pantry shelf in order from right to left, the next one after shredded wheat happens to be Special K. That's the one I take. God knew that I tend to take the cereals. Yes, I'm anal retentive. God knows that I take the cereals right to left. And I'm free to not. I could just have oatmeal and go on a different shelf and make the oatmeal and make it the way I like to make it. But I didn't. I chose, and God could very well have predicted that. That's what I mean. I'm free, and yet God pretty well knows what I'm going to do all the time, and knows what you're going to do just about at any time. Well, that's all speculative. We don't know for sure how our free will and God's sovereign guidance of our lives work together. It is a mystery. We should probably leave it a mystery and stop trying to explain it all. All right. But at least the psalmist is saying in verse 16 that the number of his days is known to God. They're written in God's book. How long will he live? He believes God has a certain number of days for his life, and that those were written in God's book from the beginning. In another psalm he says, "Teach me to number my days that I may gain a heart of wisdom." So all his days were formed for him when none of them as yet existed. Amazing. Even that causes him to say, "Wow, how weighty are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. I can't believe you know all this stuff about everyone and everything. I can't even count them. If I try, they're more than grains of sand." Just one handful of sand. Did you ever try to count the grains in a handful of sand, let alone the whole darn beach? No, can't be done. It's impossible. Well, theoretically it's possible. You'd probably have to have a magnifying glass and segment the sand off in your hand, and by then you might drop some, and can't be done. Let's just say that when the psalmist tries to think about the thoughts of God, it's impossible. He comes to the end of the thoughts of God? Probably not. Think the end of his life. This section of the psalm is about the beginning and end of life. When he comes to the end of the days that have been formed for him, I come to the end, and amazingly, just as at the beginning when I was totally unaware of God in the womb, when I come to the end, there God will still be. God will be with me wherever I am and whatever day it is of my life, whether it's the first day after conception or the last day after I die, God is with me. Then comes this amazing break. Verses 19 through 22. "Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me, those who speak maliciously of you and lift up themselves against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." Notice that he has to count them his enemies, but they're actually God's enemies. He doesn't say really that they have done anything to him. They have not tried to kill him. The bloodthirsty people have not affected him directly, but they speak maliciously of God and lift up themselves against God for evil and hate God and rise up against God. And the psalmist is saying, just as you have been loyal to me through my whole life from conception on and wherever I am and wherever I go, and you know everything about me, just as you have been totally loyal to me in grace and mercy and compassion my whole life, I will be totally loyal to you, and therefore I will despise these enemies of yours who are opposed to you. I'm on your side just as you've been on my side. Some commentators think the whole psalm through verse 18 has been a preparation for these 4 verses that seem so contrary to the spirit of the rest of the psalm. That the first 18 verses have demonstrated God's loving loyalty to the psalmist, and now the psalmist, this is the best way he can think about demonstrating his loving loyalty to God, to hate the enemies of God. Just as they're God's enemies, so now they will become the psalmist's enemies, and that's how he shows God his loyalty in response to God's loyalty to him. I think that makes some sense in terms of how to read this abrupt change in the psalm. And then it goes back in verses 23 and 24 to a closing prayer which reiterates what he had just said in the opening of the psalm in verse 1. In verse 23, he asked God to search me and know my heart, and test me and know my thoughts. And that's exactly what the opening verse says God has already done, and already does do, and continues to do. You continue to search me and know me. You know my thoughts from afar. You are acquainted with all my ways. And the psalmist says again to the Lord, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts. See if there's anything wrong with me, and let me know about that. And then lead me in the way everlasting." Clearly, this closing prayer, which says, "See if there's any wicked way in me," means at least that what he has said in verses 19 through 22 are not in his own mind anything wrong. He has not said anything wrong. Hating the enemies of God is not wrong from the psalmist's point of view. Search me, know me, try my heart, see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I want to live in such a way that I continue to be pleasing to you, and that you will continue to guide and lead me with your amazing knowledge. Well, that's how I read Psalm 139, and that took us our whole 30 minutes, didn't it? I'll just say a couple words about Psalm 140. It's a classic lament. It has all four standard elements of the lament, and I'm relying on Walter Brueggemann's commentary on the Psalms here, and he says that the standard lament elements are present in the address to God. Are present, and the first one is addressing God. "Deliver me, O Lord, guard me, O Lord. I say to the Lord, you are my God," picking out 3 verses in this psalm where God is directly addressed. So the 4 standard elements of lament are address to God, the portrayal of the problem or the crisis, and clearly that is done in 2 passages in Psalm 140, a detailed description of the enemies in verses 1 through 5, and a further description of the enemies and what the psalmist thinks God should do to them in verses 9 through 11. So when you look at all the descriptors of the enemies, that is the portrayal of the crisis. And these are, in fact, the psalmist's enemies. Now, back in Psalm 139, they were God's enemies, and only indirectly or secondarily did they become the psalmist's enemies out of loyalty to God. But here, clearly, these are the psalmist's own enemies, and he wants God to deliver him from them. And so that's the third element. If the first element is an address to God, and the second is the portrayal of the problem or the crisis, the third element is asking God to do something about them. Guard me, deliver me, rescue me, help me, protect me. These are elements of the petition here in Psalm 140. And then, surprisingly, maybe to us, not so to most of the psalmists, there is always a hopeful conclusion. Well, I think there are 1 or 2 laments that aren't hopeful in conclusion, but they typically are. And here the conclusion is, the psalmist knows that God maintains the cause of the needy and executes justice for the poor, and so he says, "Surely the righteous will give thanks to you, and the upright will live in your presence." There's this ending that is hopeful, that the crisis will be resolved by God, because God will act to do justice and protect the lives of his loved ones who are poor and needy and call upon him for help. All those elements are standard elements of the lament, and you could say that Psalm 140 is a good example of the Psalms of lament, which ask God to act and give God suggestions about how God might act to overwhelm and defeat these enemies, so that the evil they plan against the psalmist might fall upon their own heads. All right, Psalms 139 and 140. Thanks for your patience, and we'll continue to do 10 more Psalms, and we'll be done with the Psalter and have to decide what else to do. I'll keep you posted. Thank you for participating in this study of the book of Psalms.